Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And what we're doing in this brief sort of history of philosophy is we're discussing the key issues or the key footnotes in the history of philosophy. And as we've said in previous episodes, we're not trying to do an in-depth study on each philosopher or even each idea in the history of philosophy. What we're trying to do is communicate the big ideas that are most important about each key figure so that the average person can have an understanding of the ebb and flow of the history of philosophy. And we did this by really just looking at this notion that in many respects, philosophy can be understood as a series of footnotes. And by footnotes, we mean ways that they're going to make an extra comment or detraction from Plato. So are they accepting Plato, rejecting Plato, modifying Plato? And we've been looking at that in ancient philosophy. And now what we're going to do is we're going to jump into medieval philosophy. And as we do that, what I want to do is I want us to really just think about the importance of medieval philosophy and probably the key contribution of medieval philosophy, which is Christianity. And what people don't realize is that Christians during this time period dominated the university scene because they were using divine special revelation, namely the Bible, in order to answer these philosophical questions. Now, in many respects, the ancient Greeks, specifically Aristotle and Plato, they were pointing us in some kind of a right direction. They were seeing that there was an aspect of a fixed reality that's out there that has absolute morals and man has a purpose and we're thinking creatures in this sense, but they were incomplete. And what happened is that figures like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas completed that project. And the point is that reason has its limits. And sometimes what we have to find is that the Bible corrects those limits. And that's specifically what we found in medieval philosophy. Now, one of the major charges that people tried to bring against medieval Christian philosophy, ironically coming from contemporary Christians, is that it's nothing more than baptized Aristotle or baptized Plato in that regard. And what we have to find is that preaches very well, but it doesn't always flesh its way out into many of the significant concepts and nuances that these figures took in order to ensure that they weren't baptized Platonists or baptized Aristotelian figures. There are many areas, and we're going to look at just a few of them today, where they radically departed from them to almost make a difference of kind, not a difference of degree. Now, we're going to label these figures as Christian Platonists and Christian Aristotelian philosophers for the sole purpose that we want to say that there are great similarities, but we're also going to talk about the dissimilarities because there's a half-truth to their claim, and that's why it keeps preaching well in today's era. And what I want to do real quick is I want to talk about one little book that discusses this in great detail. And it's a book titled God and Philosophy by a figure named Étienne Gilson. And in this book, what he's trying to do is he's trying to look at the notion of the concept of God and what do we mean by God. And he breaks it down into four different eras: God in Greek philosophy, God in Christian philosophy, which was during really in the medieval era and brought into the contemporary age, and God in modern philosophy, and God in contemporary thought. And the reason is that behind it is that different eras don't actually think about God in the same way. We find that the Greeks had something radically different than the Christians held to the concept of God. And modern philosophy, with the rise of agnosticism and later contemporary philosophy building off of those theses, had many rejection theses of the Christian and even the Aristotelian and Platonic views of divine being. And the reason I say that is that we have to see that many of the figures that are critiquing the medieval view of, say, Augustine or Aquinas, they're actually giving us a God that's more in continuity with modern and contemporary philosophy. And if you go and look throughout this channel, we've dealt with things related to this, specifically as it's going to relate to the idea of theistic personalism or theistic mutualism, where they try to make this difference of degree between God and man versus a difference of kind. And a difference of degree is something like you have a small circle and a big circle, or a small square and a big square. The only difference essentially between them is one of degree, one of size. Whereas the difference of kind would be the difference between a circle and a square. You can add all the different sides you want onto the square, and it may approach the circle, but it never actually becomes the circle because there's a difference of kind between them. So let's jump into this. The main point that we've been arguing is the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes on Plato. And we saw that the main detractor from Plato was really Aristotle. Now, he didn't reject his forms, but he modified him. He said there's certain areas where he's right, but there's certain areas where he's wrong. And we saw other key figures from ancient philosophy. And one of the things that we looked at is that in a broad sense, we're dealing with rationalism and empiricism. Does knowledge come before experience? And we have a knowledge of the forms from maybe the pre-existence of the soul, Plato would say. And then we are seeing as they're participating in the material reality. Or are we empiricists, saying knowledge comes after experience? We know things from the sense particular world. We abstract those forms from them, and that gives us our knowledge. Now, one of the things that we're going to find here is that you have Christians on both sides of this. Augustine, in many respects, was a Christian rationalist, drawing many of his theses from Plato. In addition, we're going to find that Aquinas was a Christian empiricist, drawing many of his ideas from Aristotle. And like we said before, they're not drawing everything. They're not pulling everything from these figures. There are key areas, and we could look at them at a later time, where they're actually detracting from them. But what we're going to look at today is how do we get to modern philosophy? In particular, we're going to see later in the next episode of how rationalism and empiricism find their synthesis within Immanuel Kant, who is really just the height and the chief key figure of modern philosophy. So with no further ado, let's jump into this. The first major sort of medieval philosopher who is looking at this whole notion of Plato and how we should understand the forms is Plotinus. Now, Plotinus was the founder of what was known as Neoplatonism, which was really giving us a resurgence of Platonism, but in many respects, he's altering and modifying certain aspects of Plato. He was a Roman from the 3rd century AD. But notice this, Plotinus is really one of the first key philosophical figures after the rise and the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Plotinus was probably his thought and his movement, one of the key things that Christians actually pushed against during that era. In many respects, he was a figure that gave us ideas that were incompatible with Christianity. So a figure like Augustine ended up rejecting many of the things of Neoplatonism in certain aspects. But what we have to find is that the apologetic task was engaging Neoplatonism. But as we look at this, Plotinus identified Plato's idea of the good with this notion of the one. And the one for Plotinus was conceived as an infinite and mystically transcending all reason. And within Plotinus, you have this, what's known as emanational pantheism. Now, pantheism is the idea that all is God and God is all. The tree is God, you are God, the dog is God. Everything is divine in some way, shape, or form. And what it's doing is it's starting out with the one, and as it's emanating, coming forth in different spheres or different levels of which that divinity is represented, they're all divine. But the point is that the one, in and of itself, it's truly infinite and it transcends all reason. So if Plotinus identified Plato's idea of the good with the one, and Plato was arguing that in order to have knowledge, you must have these knowledge of the forms or the good, Plotinus was rejecting that. And in many ways, what he's trying to say is that we can't know the one. He's giving us a detraction thesis from Plato because we can't know this infinite being, this infinite thing, and the way we know it is not rationally, but mystically. See, Plotinus affirmed a larger epistemology and, as we said, a metaphysic of emanationalism. But this is still a footnotes approach. He's still affirming in many ways the great chains of being that we find within ancient and medieval philosophy, but he's trying to say you can't know the very top. He's trying to say that there's no way to know the very top, the one. For him, reason could not know the one for two reasons, and these are the two key reasons. First, reason always involved the duality of the knower and the known, or the subject and the object. Two, reason required finitude in its object. whether that object was physical, a tree, dog, or cat, or spiritual, ideas like justice or the one. So if reason requires the knower and the known to become one, but it also requires that the object that's known to be finite, that's the issue. God is infinite. This transcendental one is infinite. Hence, it's not finite. Hence, it cannot be fully known. And it has to be known mystically. So what we find is that Neoplatonism was a modification of Plato that left us in this pantheistic, emanational, mystical, non-known, infinite one. And Christianity during this time was saying, no, we can know the one true God. And we know it by divine revelation. And that's why one of the key apologetic tasks was to make sure that people could know God. Now, do we know God exhaustively? No, but you don't have to know everything about God to know something about God. I don't have to know everything about any particular thing in order to know something about it. And that's the whole point, is just because we don't have an exhaustive knowledge of God doesn't mean that we don't have true knowledge of finite things about God. Now let's move on to the next one, Christian Platonism with St. Augustine. Now, St. Augustine was the most formative Christian thinker of his era and maybe in the history of the Christian church. He was a Roman African from the 4th century AD. Probably some of his most famous books would be The City of God, or his whole treatise where we're going to see in Confessions, where he's talking about his conversion to Christianity and how he was, in many respects, birthed during this time period of ancient and medieval philosophy, Neoplatonism, and the role that it was playing within society and the academy. But like we said here, he was probably the most formative Christian thinker of his era, but I also add maybe in the history of the church, because what we have to find is that all people following Augustine were really building upon Augustine's thought, whether that be Aquinas, who in many respects theologically was an Augustinian, or a figure like Martin Luther or John Calvin or Jonathan Edwards. And we can even come into many contemporary figures today that are building upon many of Augustine's theological and philosophical ideas. And for that reason, he's been claimed by both Catholics and Protestants. He's seen as the most formative Christian thinker during his era. In fact, I would argue that he was probably the most formative thinker during his era. And for that reason, I think people need to spend an ample amount of time studying St. Augustine. But what we have to find is that if we're just sticking with our footnotes approach, not diving too much into all of the other issues, Augustine completed much of Plato's project by giving the forms a new postal address, namely by giving Plato's ideas a home in the mind of God. Now, one of the things that we saw is that Aristotle gave Plato's whole project a new postal address. Instead of leaving the forms somewhere outside of here, he put them in things themselves. And what Augustine did is he said, no, they find their greatest home in the mind of God, their divine ideas. That's why they seem outside of this world, yet there's something real about them in this world, because based upon the divine ideas, God's creative decree came about that in many respects gave these true essences to finite beings. Now, what we have to find is that in the Confessions, Augustine credits Plato with freeing him from materialistic thinking and introducing him to eternal truths, namely the notion of an absolute good. And what's interesting about Plato is that he gave us this idea of an absolute good, but he didn't always locate it the way that Christians changed it through the doctrine of revelation. But what's also interesting about Augustine is that Augustine's very transparent about his views and his sort of trajectory by which he came to his views and his history of coming to those views. He was in this materialistic thinking, and it was through Plato that he saw that materialism fell short. And that's why I think Augustine can be so formative for us today, because we live in a materialistic age. And I think if people return to Augustine's Confessions, we see the real struggle people have when they're coming out of these different movements and the way that they're having to engage these different ideas, which sort of makes me pause and stop and give sort of a practical footnote here that if you're a person who is struggling with many of these things and you're trying to figure them out, I would really encourage you to read Augustine's Confessions. See what it looks like to wrestle with these ideas in a very Christian way, but yet also recognizing that doubt is a reality. People do doubt things, but I want you to see how he engages with the philosophical ideas and how he uses the Bible to engage those philosophical ideas and questions, and how he uses the Bible to answer many of those questions. But if you're a Christian philosopher or apologist today, or even a pastor and a theologian, I would also encourage you to read Confessions. Maybe you're struggling with it, and if you're not struggling with it, people within your church or within your sphere of influence are, and we can see how Augustine helps us bridge that gap with people. But what I want us to see here is that Augustine actually faults Plato for not giving individuals a personal relationship with this eternal truth. Whereas what we see is Plato identified eternal truth as an idea. Augustine, and really all of Christianity, identified it as a person. And the reason that it's a person is that eternal truth is God. God is truth. God doesn't contain truth. God doesn't point at truth. God doesn't just create truth. God, by his very being, is truth. Just like it says in 1 John, God is love. God is his attributes. God is love. God is truth. God is justice. God is mercy. He's not just the idea of these things. In fact, where we find strong defenses of what is known as the doctrine of divine simplicity, God is made up of no parts, also passions, is formative in Augustine's thought, because he realizes that God is one. He's not a bundle of properties. It's not like he's a bunch of grapes that are sort of held together with all these individual properties representing the individual grapes. Rather, God's love is his justice, and his justice is his goodness. And these identity properties, and we have a whole other podcast on this, can be found in Augustine and Anselm, not just Aquinas. It's not just this Thomistic doctrine of simplicity. It's the doctrine of simplicity. And that's one of the key areas. We see that Augustine was an acceptance thesis because he accepts the notion of the forms. He modifies Plato by putting them in the mind of God, but he also modifies them even more by, instead of making them just this non-personal idea, they're identified as a person. Now, moving on to the next one, Christian Aristotelianism with St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was an Italian Dominican from the 13th century. And if Augustine was probably the most influential figure during his era, Aquinas definitely was in his. So what we find is that Augustine from the 4th century, Aquinas from the 13th century, there's quite a bit of a time period in between these two figures. And one of the key differences is that for a variety of reasons, Aristotle's thought, his philosophy, was sort of lost to the West for a while. And then through a variety of means, specifically the rise of Islam and their use of Aristotle, there was a rediscovery of Aristotle and a rebirth of Aristotelian thought within the academy. And that's what Aquinas was birthed into, was this renaissance of Aristotelian thought and the way that the academy was studying Aristotle, both in his metaphysic and his epistemology and his ethics and so much more. And what Aquinas sought to do was to defend Christianity in light of this Aristotelian philosophy that was permeating throughout the universities. Now, in certain respects, he accepted a lot of it as being truth, because wherever you find true truth, it exists at all times, at all places. There's no sort of time stamp upon truth. Truth is, in one sense, eternal, and all truth is God's truth if the thing is actually true. And he thought that there were many true things within Aristotle. Now, he doesn't accept everything that Aristotle taught. Any simple reading of the Summa, or even just commentaries on the Summa or books on Aquinas, will show you key areas where he detracted from both Plato and Aristotle. But what we have to find is that Aquinas combined Aristotle and Augustine's corrections to Plato's forms. So what we know that Aristotle did is that he put the forms in things, and Augustine also put them in the mind of God. Those are the two corrections to Plato's forms. Here's what I want you to see here. For Aquinas, the ideas do not exist in themselves, Plato, but only in the mind of God, Augustine, and they exist as the forms of material things, Aristotle, and as concepts in our minds, which would be Aristotle, which abstract them from things. No, to some degree, anyone who affirms the reality of forms is technically a Platonist. In that sense, Aristotle, Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas were all Christian Platonists. However, the way they differ is found in the location or postal address of the forms. So we understand the idea of a postal address. It's going to get your mail to a different house. And for Plato, we said the postal address is something outside of this world. Aristotle puts them in this world. Augustine puts them out of this world, but in the mind of God. Aquinas puts them in this world and in things. So how do we reconcile all of this? What do we see that's going on with this? Well, in one sense, Plato and Aristotle were right. There is something where they're outside of this world and in this world. And Christianity was able to answer this by saying, yeah, they're divine ideas. And in the act of creation, God places those essences in created things. So in this sense, I'm actually a Thomist in this regard, because I think that they are formally in the things and we can abstract them from the things, but in an exemplary cause sense, in their greatest sense, they are divine ideas. And what is creation? God bringing divine ideas, creating matter out of nothing, and giving essences to things. So we can say it like that, or we could say something along these lines, that God created all things and he created them according to their kind, which is the doctrine of creation found in Genesis 1 and 2. This is something very formative for Christianity, is this idea of creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. And one way to understand it is that if we understand that each thing has its own essence, well, where does that distinction come from? The mind of God and the special creative act of God and the providence of God in that regard. Now, another key figure during this time was William of Occam. Occam was a 13th century English philosopher, and he's probably most famously known for this notion of Occam's razor, which really argues that explanations should always be as simple as possible and avoid postulating unnecessary entities. And there's a lot of truth to this notion of Occam's razor. You know, probably the best explanation for why the cookies are not in the cookie jar is the little kid ran up and took the cookies out of the cookie jar. And we know it for these reasons. One, he's got crumbs all over his face. He's got chocolate on his hands. The cookie jar is clearly open, and the top of the cookie jar is in his hand. Probably a better explanation than to say aliens came into the room, stole the cookies, rubbed them all over the little boy's face, told him to hold the top of the cookie jar, and took the cookies for themselves. But also we find that, you know, in real scientific explanations, or when we're trying to give them, sometimes the simplest explanation is the best explanation, because what it's doing is that it's giving us something that's not requiring more of a cause than's present in the effect. But the key thing that we find within Occam is this notion of nominalism. And nominalism is a claim that there are no real, independently existing universals, forms, or ideas. Universal terms only refer to a collection of particular things. So how does Occam, or nominalism, differ significantly from Plato? It totally rejects the forms altogether. They're not real things. Notice what it's saying here. There are no real, independently existing universals, which we know what a universal is. You have particular men or humanity as such, forms or ideas. So what about when we use this in our language? What about when we talk about them in propositional form, or we refer to them? He says, well, they're just terms. They're really mental fictions. So whenever language discusses universals, they're mental fictions, linguistic fictions. We may think about them and use them in language, but they are not true and exist independently. They're just things that we use in normal, ordinary language that don't actually refer to real essences or real forms that are out there. So in that sense, like we said, nominalism is a rejection thesis of Plato and his theory of forms. And what we have to find is that it is the main metaphysical assumption of much of modern and contemporary philosophy, specifically as it differs from Aristotelian logic and later analytic philosophy and symbolic logic. And what we have to find is that so much of modern philosophy was removing itself, trying to do away with what they saw as these dogmatic Aristotelian Platonic forms that were sort of binding or chaining people into these formal causalities and these final causalities. And modern philosophy, as we'll see, tried to explain things apart from these essential natures and these so-called purposes for which things are operating. So let's think about this just so that we have a working understanding of it. If we're going to look at a chair, literally just like a wooden chair, the classic explanation is that there are different types of causes. Formal causality of the chair would be its chairness. Its material causality could be it's made out of plastic, or it could be made out of wood, or it could be made out of metal. Its efficient causality would be whoever put the chair together, namely the chair maker. And its final causality would be the purpose for which the chair exists, which would be, in this sense, to sit in it. And we find that these four different causes are Aristotle's four different notions of causality: formal causality, material causality, efficient causality, and final causality. And what Occam and many of the other figures were doing was dropping the notion of formal causality. We don't need formal causality in order to have a right explanation. In one sense, Occam's razor hacked off formal causality. And as we'll see later, a figure like Francis Bacon and his Novum Organum and his new method that he's going to give us was knocking out formal and final causality. We don't need these types of explanations in order for science to have any truthfulness in our world. But what I also want you to see here is that if we're going to jump way ahead to really contemporary philosophy, and you see analytic philosophy and its notion of the linguistic turn and what they're trying to do within symbolic logic, one of the key differences between Aristotelian logic and symbolic logic is the role of forms or essences or universals. And if you want a greater explanation of that, go read Socratic Logic by Peter Kraft, or go read the book titled Two Logics by Veitch. And what they're doing in that book, or both of those books, is giving us an understanding and explanation for the strengths and weaknesses of analytic philosophy and symbolic logic and Socratic logic or Aristotelian philosophy in that sense. And I'll just lay my cards out there. I definitely follow the Aristotelian logic approach. I think that we must look at logical analyses through the forms, through the essences, through these different aspects there. I'm laying my cards out on the table. But what we have to also find is that as we continue going through, you have Machiavellianism or Machiavelli, and he's most known as a political figure. And Machiavelli was an Italian from the 15th century. If you can't tell, we're kind of hitting a few of the key figures from different centuries. Machiavelli is almost a total contrast from Plato. He claims one error of classical philosophers such as Plato was that they taught us how to be good, but he claims in order to be successful, you must learn how to be evil. See the key distinction right then and there. One is to pursue good, one is to pursue evil. Injustice for him is clever enough, practically works, and more profitable than justice. You see the strong correlation between views and ideas and ethics coming about in Machiavelli? He was a pragmatist in the fullest sense. The ends of practical success justify the means. He is a materialist rather than a spiritualist. All men are in constant competition with each other. There's no spiritual aspects, and you shouldn't trust them because they are nothing more than matter. In addition, he was a relativist versus a moralist. You should only keep your word when or if it benefits you. So in many respects, Plato was the sort of penultimate non-pragmatist. He was definitely not a materialist, and he wasn't a relativist. He was a moralist and objectivist. He was a spiritualist, and he was trying to argue for a notion of virtue ethics, not pragmatic ethics, that it's not just that we get to the right end, we got to do it in the right way. It's so interesting because so much of Machiavellianism is what dominates so much of the world that we live in today. I mean, just think about this. If we can say that the ends justifies the means, I mean, it's a precursor to utilitarianism and the notion of pragmatism in that regard, or this idea that all men are in constant competition with each other, there's no spiritual, and you shouldn't trust them. Think about what this does to business and what this does to politics and what this does to friendships and what it does to really Plato's whole idea within the Republic of the good society. If the student can't trust the teacher and the teacher can't trust the student and both can't trust the politician and you can't trust the philosopher king because we're all just matter in constant competition with one another, what does that do to society? It's the complete undoing of the Republic in that regard. Now we come to another figure, which is Francis Bacon, and his project can be understood as a conquest of nature by technology. Francis Bacon was an Englishman, 16th century thinker, and a scientist who gave us the modern scientific method and a specific version of induction. Now, induction is something that many empiricists will rely upon, but his version of induction was really one that doesn't have formal causality and it doesn't have final causality within it. Now, Bacon insists that we should not study things, as we said, for their formal or final causality, two key facets of Aristotelian philosophy. But also, he's giving us a denial of the necessity of the forms, the formal causality. So in this sense, by denying these within Aristotle, he's also denying the notion of having formal causality in Plato. So in that sense, he's a detraction thesis. Bacon insists that truth is important for man's power, for man's conquest of nature through the applied science and technology. This differs from Plato, who thought knowledge was for truth, not power, and that truth was absolute, not man's conquest over nature was an absolute. So what is the supreme good of man? For Bacon, it was the conquest of nature. His summum bonum for him was this conquest thesis. Now, what we find is that Bacon is more concerned with physical science than spiritual wisdom, inductive reasoning above deductive reasoning. Why? Because deductive reasoning has to be based upon universals and abstract general principles. Keeping going here, just for the sake of time, we also see that philosophy started to be overtaken by science. And this is what we find in René Descartes, which is, in many respects, a philosophical approach that is philosophy must be nothing more than science. So Descartes was a French 17th century philosopher, and here's where we start to see his philosophy by science. Descartes does this because he narrows reason to mathematical reasoning and the scientific method. Reason now must be a mathematical kind of science or a geometrical system of deduction, but it is not Plato's reason in the highest form. So let's look at this. We have to really have an understanding of Plato's divided line to understand what was actually said here. First, within this, Plato has four different categories of this. You have the sensing of images of physical things. This is his first level. The reflection in the water, images which are less than the real and actual things. So if you're looking in the water and you see a reflection of yourself, the reflection is less real than you. The reflection is giving a portrait of you or a sense image of you, the real physical thing. Second, the direct sensation of physical things. So if the first is the reflection of you in the water, the second is actually you. The third, which is the understanding of mathematical ideas, quantitative forms like triangles or numbers, not sensation, but logical reasoning like mathematics. And his fourth, which is the vision of ideas, the qualitative forms, which is reason for Plato. And it's that fourth aspect that Descartes doesn't want to have any really adherence unto. He's trying to say that that's really too much for reason. And he's trying to locate reason in this third form. Where does reason rightly exist? How can we rightly have adjudication between different views? Well, it's by having a mathematical, quantitative, and scientific approach to philosophy. In short, Descartes' goal is to find reason in this third section, whereas Plato sought to find it in the fourth. We see the detraction theses right there within Descartes. The purpose was to try and bring philosophy under the same method as the scientific method and to resolve all the major philosophical disputes with that method. And I think there's one aspect that's virtuous to what Descartes was trying to do. Clearly, science answers questions. Clearly, science has brought about the great technological revolutions within Western society, whether that be in medicine or in engineering or any other sphere that we live today. It's clearly doing something. So in that regard, Descartes was doing something virtuous, something beneficial to society. But what we find is that he takes reason, and yes, he's narrowing it, and we'll find that he almost narrows it too much. The modern issue in philosophy is they all try to locate reason in a different place, and they also try to place limits upon reason. And what we're going to find is that this limiting of reason, whether it comes from an empiricist and say a figure like Hume, is going to give us the limiting of reason into skepticism, or you're going to find it within the transcendental method later, and we'll explain that within Kant, is he's going to limit reason to the point that we can't know God. So what we find is that with Descartes, he's right in the sense that he sought to end all disputes, but he probably did it in a way that limited reason too much. But he also tried to end all disputes because of the time period in which he lived. Many of the key issues were philosophical and religious by nature. He did live during the 30 Years' War. In addition, Descartes, in one sense, was a Socrates of modern philosophy. Namely, he tried to give us a new method and to do away with all of his predecessors. However, he was very Platonic, even if that means he only repeated the themes. Notice this. Forms were replaced with eternal truths. He gave us the rule of reason. It was just a lower form of reason. The existence of spirituality was still there and the immortality of the soul. All evil is epistemological and traced back to ignorance. He still gives us a two-substance view of man. Now, instead of being this metaphysical notion, he's giving them more closer to modern science where they're just clear and distinct ideas. But he was also a rationalist rather than an empiricist, the notion of innate ideas. And that's where we see here is that if you look at this chart, you see Plato in the upper left-hand portion, and Descartes, in many respects, was his modern heir. Not error, like he messed up, but heir in the sense of the person who's receiving much of this. Why? Because there are many similarities between them, but the key distinction is, like we said here, as we back up, let's just back up here one, is that he was trying to find reason in Plato's third section, as Plato sought to put it in his fourth section. So what I want us to see here as we finish for the day is that we have gone through and we've looked at medieval philosophy as it relates to Plato and his forms, and we see that people were mystics, and we see that Christians recognize that through the doctrine of creation and the absolute distinction between God and creation, that they put these forms not as some ethereal third thing, but as divine ideas within the mind of God. And the doctrine of creation, specifically from a figure like Aquinas, said, well, they exist as divine ideas, but they also exist in things themselves. We see rejection theses from nominalists who did away with the good, the idea of the forms. And we see the rise of modern science that wants to do away with formal causality and create sort of this mathematical, quantitative approach in which they're not looking at formal or final causality. And what we're going to do going forward is that we're going to see how this rationalism and empiricism find their culmination in skepticism. People were either overly dogmatic with what they thought the scientific method and these rational speculations could give with figures like Spinoza and Leibniz, or what we find is that a figure like Hume said, well, this is going to lead us to a form of skepticism. And we'll deal with that in particular going forward. In fact, our next one is going to be Footnotes on Plato, Spinoza to Hume. So what I want us to consider here as we're finishing is I hope that you're seeing right now that this entire Footnotes approach helps us to understand the key ideas, to give us a key framework to understand what people are doing with Plato and with this idea of the history of philosophy. Because I think so many of the conversations that we have today seem to be quite shallow because we don't actually understand really the history by which our conversations have even come about. We've been locked into a form of education that really hasn't, delved deep into many of these key histories and these key issues, the great books of Western philosophy. So with that, we're going to jump into modern philosophy sort of 2.0 next time, and we're going to look from Spinoza, the great pantheist, to David Hume, the great skeptic.